Behind Sergio Leone's iconic spaghetti western lies a treasure trove of bizarre secrets that even die-hard fans don't know. From an airplane accidentally caught on camera during a shootout scene to Klaus Kinski's reputation for never working with the same director twice, except one, the production was filled with surprising mishaps, unconventional casting choices, and groundbreaking rule-breaking that Hollywood didn't even know existed. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about for a few dollars more. Fact 1. A plane flies over the Old West. In one of the most amusing continuity errors in Western film history, a modern airplane accidentally photobombs one of the most iconic scenes in For a Few Dollars More. During the memorable sequence where Manco and Colonel Mortimer engage in their impressive marksmanship display by shooting each other's hats, viewers with sharp eyes can spot the unmistakable lights of an aircraft flying overhead in the night sky above Clint Eastwood's head. This scene takes place in the fictional town of Agua Caliente, where the two bounty hunters first demonstrate their shooting skills to each other in what becomes a friendly competition. Manco shoots 3 apples off a tree to show off his accuracy, and Mortimer responds by shooting 4 more apples from his vantage point in a second-story window. The sequence was designed to establish the mutual respect between these two professional gunmen, but it inadvertently captured something that had no business being in the 1870s American frontier. The airplane lights appear during a quick shot focused on Eastwood's character, creating an unintentional time travel moment that places 20th-century aviation technology squarely in the middle of the Old West. This type of anachronistic mistake was particularly easy to make during the era when For a Few Dollars More was filmed in 1965, as commercial air travel was becoming increasingly common over the Spanish locations where Sergio Leone shot his spaghetti westerns. The error went unnoticed during editing and post-production, likely because the lights appear briefly and might have been mistaken for stars or other atmospheric elements during the review process. The airplane becomes an amusing reminder that even the most carefully crafted period films can be invaded by the modern world, creating moments where past and present collide in unexpected ways. This particular mistake has become a favorite discovery among film enthusiasts who enjoy hunting for continuity errors in classic movies. Fact 2. Sergio Leone's secret whistling cameo. The haunting whistle that opens For a Few Dollars More and immediately sets the film's mysterious tone wasn't performed by a professional musician or even a member of Ennio Morricone's orchestra, but rather by director Sergio Leone himself, who provided this distinctive musical element that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in Western cinema. Leone's whistling appears prominently during the opening credits sequence, creating an atmospheric backdrop that perfectly establishes the film's mood before a single word of dialogue is spoken or any character appears on screen. This personal contribution from the director represents an unusual level of hands-on involvement in the film's audio landscape, especially considering that Leone was working with one of the most talented film composers of all time in Morricone. The decision for Leone to whistle the melody himself, rather than hiring a professional whistler or using a studio musician, demonstrates the director's desire to maintain complete creative control over every aspect of his film. This level of personal investment in even the smallest details shows how Leone approached filmmaking as a total artistic vision, where nothing was too minor for his direct attention. The whistling technique that Leone used became so closely associated with the spaghetti western genre that it influenced countless other films in the years that followed. His simple but effective melodic line helped establish a new musical vocabulary for Western movies that moved away from the traditional orchestral approaches used by Hollywood studios during the same period. Leone's musical contribution adds another layer to his already impressive list of filmmaking skills, proving that his talents extended beyond directing and visual storytelling into the realm of sound design and musical performance. The fact that audiences have been listening to the director's own voice whistling for nearly 60 years without knowing it makes this one of cinema's best-kept secrets, hidden in plain sight throughout the film's opening moments. Fact 3. First major movie marijuana use. Film historians widely consider For a Few Dollars More to feature the first depiction of marijuana smoking by a character in a major Hollywood production, though the film deliberately avoids explicitly naming the substance that the villain El Indio consumes throughout the movie. This groundbreaking moment in cinema occurred during an era when Hollywood was still operating under strict moral guidelines that typically prevented such controversial content from appearing on screen. El Indio, played by Gian Maria Volante, is shown smoking what appears to be marijuana cigarettes during several key scenes, particularly when he experiences disturbing flashbacks related to a traumatic incident from his past involving a woman's suicide. The drug use serves a specific narrative purpose in the film, as it helps explain El Indio's psychological state and provides context for his erratic and violent behavior throughout the story. The film presents this drug use in a deliberately ambiguous way, never actually stating what substance El Indio is smoking, which allowed the filmmakers to include this controversial element while avoiding direct confrontation with censorship boards. Viewers can observe El Indio becoming visibly intoxicated, sometimes falling asleep with his eyes open or giggling uncontrollably, but the exact nature of his drug remains officially unspecified in the dialogue or script. This creative approach to depicting drug use represented a significant departure from traditional Hollywood westerns of the time, which typically avoided such mature themes entirely. Sergio Leone's willingness to include this element demonstrates how the Italian-made spaghetti westerns were pushing boundaries and exploring darker, more complex character motivations than their American counterparts. The inclusion of marijuana use was part of Leone's broader pattern of breaking unwritten Hollywood rules, often without even realizing these rules existed. This particular boundary-pushing moment helped establish the more adult-oriented tone that would become characteristic of the spaghetti western genre and influenced how later films would approach similar controversial subject matter. Fact 4. Eastwood's backwards bullet hold poncho. Clint Eastwood wears the exact same iconic poncho in For a Few Dollars More that he used in A Fistful of Dollars. But the costume department made a curious decision to flip the garment inside out, creating a visible reminder of his character's previous adventures. The mended bullet holes that were originally positioned on the left breast area of the poncho are now clearly visible over the right shoulder blade, providing eagle-eyed viewers with a direct visual connection between the two films. The bullet holes in question came from the climactic shootout in A Fistful of Dollars, where Eastwood's character took several hits to his improvised body armor, made from a metal plate hidden beneath his poncho. After filming wrapped on the first movie, the costume department carefully repaired these bullet holes with visible patches and stitching, creating what would become an unintentional piece of movie history. When production began on the sequel, rather than creating a new poncho or attempting to hide the previous damage, the filmmakers chose to reverse the garment and use it as island. This practical decision likely stemmed from budget considerations and the desire to maintain visual continuity with the character's established look. Even though the films weren't originally intended to be direct sequels with the same character, the reversed poncho creates an interesting visual puzzle for viewers who notice the mended areas, as the patches and repair work are quite obvious in several scenes throughout For a Few Dollars More. The stitching and fabric repairs stand out against the weathered material of the original poncho, making it clear that this garment has seen considerable action in its previous cinematic life. This costume choice inadvertently supports the popular fan theory that connects the films as a continuous story, despite Sergio Leone's original intention to create separate, unrelated westerns. The visible battle scars on Eastwood's poncho serve as a tangible link between the movies, creating an accidental continuity that fans have embraced as evidence of the character's ongoing adventures. Fact 5. Klaus Kinski's one. Director exception. Klaus Kinski maintained one of the most unusual career patterns in film history by never working with the same director twice across his nearly 200 movie appearances, with only one remarkable exception that makes his relationship with Sergio Leone even more intriguing. The volatile German actor made his sole career exception for director Werner Herzog, with whom he collaborated on 5 films, yet he never returned to work with Leone again after For a Few Dollars More. In For a Few Dollars More, Kinski plays Juan Wilde, also known as the Hunchback, a blonde-haired member of El Indio's gang who constantly challenges both Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef's characters throughout the film. His character meets his end when he forces a confrontation with Colonel Mortimer in a saloon, deliberately provoking a shootout that results in his death. Kinski's performance in this role was memorable enough to establish him as a notable presence in the spaghetti western genre. Despite the success of For a Few Dollars More and Leone's rising reputation as a master filmmaker, Kinski never collaborated with the Italian director again. This pattern held true even as Leone went on to create some of the most celebrated westerns in cinema history, including The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West, films that featured many actors who had worked with Leone multiple times. Kinski's reputation for being difficult to work with was legendary in the film industry, and his strict policy of never repeating director collaborations suggests he either burned bridges quickly or simply preferred to avoid the complications that might arise from working with the same filmmaker twice. His willingness to break this rule only for Werner Herzog, beginning with Aguirre, The Wrath of God in 1972, demonstrates just how unique their creative partnership became. This unusual career choice meant that Kinski spread his intense screen presence across an enormous range of directors and projects, never allowing any single filmmaker to fully explore his potential through multiple collaborations. Fact 6. The Italian court character lawsuit. An Italian court officially ruled that Clint Eastwood's character Manco in For a Few Dollars More was legally not the same person as Joe from A Fistful of Dollars, settling a complex lawsuit that arose when Sergio Leone had a falling out with his original producers and decided to make his sequel with a different production company. The legal battle centered around whether the producers of the first film owned the rights to Eastwood's iconic Western gunfighter character. Jolly Films, the production company behind A Fistful of Dollars, sued Leone and his new producer Alberto Grimaldi, claiming they owned the character of Joe, and that Leone had no right to create what appeared to be the same character in a new film. The lawsuit became necessary because Leone had switched production companies after disagreements with Jolly Films, but he still wanted to continue working with Eastwood in a similar role. The court's decision hinged on a fascinating legal argument about character ownership and folklore. Leone's legal team successfully argued that the Western gunfighter persona, characterized by the distinctive costume, mannerisms, and general appearance, belonged to the public domain as part of Western folklore rather than being the specific intellectual property of any single production company. The ruling established that the visual elements that made Eastwood's character recognizable, including his poncho, hat, cigar-smoking habits, and laconic personality, were generic enough to be considered part of the traditional Western genre rather than unique creations owned by Jolly Films. This legal precedent allowed Leone to continue developing similar characters without violating copyright laws. The court's decision meant that while the characters had different names and technically different backstories, audiences could continue to enjoy what felt like the same mysterious gunfighter without any legal complications. This ruling also allowed the American distributors to later market the films as a trilogy featuring the same character, despite the original legal distinction between Joe and Manco that the Italian court had carefully maintained. Fact 7. Lee Van Cleef's massive career miscalculation. Lee Van Cleef accepted what he believed was a minor supporting role in For a Few Dollars More for just $17,000, only to discover when he finally received the complete script that he was actually being offered the position of co-star alongside Clint Eastwood in what would become one of the most important films of his career. This massive miscalculation occurred because Van Cleef had been out of major film work for several years and was so grateful for any opportunity that he didn't fully investigate the scope of his role before agreeing to the project. Van Cleef's career had hit a significant low point by the mid-1960s, with his last credited film appearance being in How the West Was Won in 1962. During this difficult period, he had been surviving primarily through television work and had even taken up painting as an alternative way to make money, making him particularly eager to accept any film role that came his way. When Sergio Leone's offer arrived, Van Cleef assumed it would involve just a handful of scenes, similar to the small character parts he had played in westerns throughout the 1950s. He was so accustomed to playing brief supporting roles that he never imagined a European director would consider him for a major starring part opposite an actor who was becoming increasingly popular after A Fistful of Dollars. The revelation that he was actually the film's co-lead came as a complete shock to Van Cleef, who reportedly was stunned when he realized the true extent of his role as Colonel Douglas Mortimer. His character not only appears throughout the entire film, but also has a personal connection to the main villain that drives much of the plot, making him arguably as important to the story as Eastwood's character. This unexpected career boost transformed Van Cleef from a struggling actor into an international star and launched his successful run in spaghetti westerns, proving that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as small jobs. Fact 8. The Morricone music. First method. Ennio Morricone composed the entire musical score for a Few Dollars More before Sergio Leone began filming any scenes, creating a revolutionary approach where the director choreographed and shot his sequences to match the pre-existing music, rather than following the traditional Hollywood method of adding music after filming was complete. This unconventional process allowed Leone to create a much tighter integration between the visual storytelling and the musical elements. resulting in scenes that feel like they were born from the music itself. Leone specifically requested that Morricone write the complete score in advance because he wanted to use the music as a creative foundation for designing his shots and directing his actors. This music-first approach meant that Leone could play the actual soundtrack on set during filming, allowing the actors to hear the rhythms and emotional tones that would accompany their performances in the finished film. The most obvious example of this technique appears in the scenes involving the musical pocket watches, where the characters' actions and dialogue are precisely timed to match the melody that plays from the watches themselves. Leone was able to achieve this perfect synchronization because he already knew exactly how long each musical phrase would last and could direct his actors to move and speak in harmony with those predetermined rhythms. Morricone wrote only about 17 minutes of original music for the film, but Leone used these compositions so effectively that the score feels much more extensive and integral to the storytelling than typical Western soundtracks of the era. The composer later explained that this collaborative method allowed him to create themes that could function both as background music and as actual sounds within the story world. This innovative approach influenced how Leone would work with Morricone on all their future collaborations, establishing a creative partnership that prioritized the musical elements as equal partners with the visual components, rather than treating the score as an afterthought to be added during post-production. Fact 9. Gian Maria Volante's English translation method. Gian Maria Volante, who played the psychotic villain El Indio, delivered his own English-language performance in For a Few Dollars More, despite not speaking a word of English, accomplishing this remarkable feat by having a translator explain every single word of his dialogue individually before he recorded each line. This painstaking process required Volante to memorize the pronunciation and meaning of each English word separately, then piece them together to create his character's menacing delivery. The Italian actor's commitment to performing his own English dialogue was unusual for the time, as most foreign actors in international productions simply had their voices replaced by English-speaking voice actors during the dubbing process. However, Volante insisted on maintaining control over his character's vocal performance, believing that his own voice was essential to creating the psychological complexity that made El Indio such a memorable villain. The translation method involved a lengthy preparation process where Volante would sit with his translator and go through each line of dialogue word by word, learning not just how to pronounce each English term, but also understanding its exact meaning and emotional context within the scene. This meticulous approach allowed him to deliver his lines with the proper inflection and timing, even though he didn't understand the language naturally. The results of this unusual technique are evident in Volante's performance, where his English dialogue maintains the same intensity and psychological depth that characterized his Italian language work. His distinctive voice and delivery style come through clearly in the English version, preserving the actor's unique interpretation of the character rather than relying on a voice actor's interpretation. This dedication to authenticity demonstrates Volante's professional commitment to his craft and his understanding that vocal performance is a crucial component of character development. His willingness to undertake such a challenging process, rather than simply allowing his voice to be dubbed, shows the level of artistic control that serious actors demanded, even in the rapidly produced spaghetti western genre. Fact 10. The El Paso set's eternal life. The massive El Paso town set that production designer Carlos Simi built in Almeria, Spain for a few dollars more, still stands today as a tourist attraction called Mini Hollywood, making it one of the most enduring physical legacies of the spaghetti western era. This elaborate western town was the biggest and most expensive set that Sergio Leone had been responsible for at the time of its construction in 1965, featuring a complete frontier community with a two-story saloon, undertaker's parlor, barber shop, telegraph office, jail, hotel, and the famous First City Bank of El Paso. Leone and his team built the set to be so realistic and detailed that it served multiple purposes beyond just for a few dollars more, becoming a valuable resource for future productions. When Leone began work on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly the following year, he cleverly reused the same El Paso set to represent several different towns throughout that film, simply changing signs, adding or removing buildings, and shooting from different angles to create the illusion of multiple locations. The set's construction was so solid and well-designed that it survived the harsh Spanish climate and continued to be used for various film and television productions long after Leone completed his trilogy. The buildings were constructed with authentic materials and traditional techniques that gave them the durability to withstand decades of exposure to the elements. Today, visitors to Mini Hollywood can walk through the same streets where Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Gian-Maria Volonté filmed their iconic scenes, experiencing the Western town exactly as it appeared in the movies. The attraction includes guided tours that explain the film history of each building and how the set was transformed for different productions. This remarkable preservation allows modern audiences to step directly into the world of Leone's westerns, making Mini Hollywood a unique destination where cinema history remains alive and accessible to fans from around the world. Fact 11. The Uruguay Map Mystery. A completely unrelated map of Uruguay hangs prominently on the wall of the Tucumcari Sheriff's Office in For a Few Dollars More, creating one of the most puzzling and inexplicable prop choices in the entire film, as this South American country has absolutely no connection to the story, the characters, or the American Southwest setting where the action takes place. The map appears clearly visible during scenes inside the sheriff's office around the 12-minute mark of the film, and its presence has never been officially explained by anyone involved in the production. Uruguay is located thousands of miles away from New Mexico, where the fictional town of Tucumcari supposedly exists in the film, making the map's appearance completely illogical from a geographical or narrative standpoint. During the 1870s time period when the movie is set, there would have been virtually no reason for a small-town American sheriff to display a map of a distant South American nation that had little interaction with the United States frontier territories. The map's prominent placement suggests it wasn't simply an accidental background element that slipped past the prop department's attention, but rather a deliberate choice that someone made during the set decoration process. However, no interviews, production notes, or behind-the-scenes documentation have ever provided an explanation for why the filmmakers decided to include this particular geographical reference in their Western setting. This mysterious prop choice has become a favorite discovery among eagle-eyed viewers who enjoy spotting unusual details in classic films, and it represents the kind of inexplicable decision that occasionally occurs during film production when practical considerations or simple mistakes create unintended moments of surreal humor. The Uruguay map joins the ranks of other famous movie props that seem to exist in the wrong place and time, serving as a reminder that even carefully crafted period films can contain elements that transport viewers far beyond the intended setting, whether through oversight, inside jokes, or decisions that made sense to someone at the time but remain forever mysterious to audiences. Fact 12. The impossible Tucumcari timeline. The film repeatedly references the town of Tucumcari as an important location where characters travel and conduct business, but this creates a significant historical impossibility because the real Tucumcari wasn't actually founded until 1901, nearly 30 years after the movie's established timeline of 1872. This anachronistic error appears multiple times throughout the film, making it one of the most persistent historical mistakes in the entire production. The movie establishes its 1872 setting through newspaper props that clearly show this date, particularly when Colonel Mortimer examines an issue of the El Paso Tribune dated Monday, June 15, 1872. However, throughout the film, characters casually mention Tucumcari as an established community where trains stop and people conduct regular business, treating it as a well-known destination in the American Southwest. In reality, the area that would eventually become Tucumcari existed only as open rangeland during the 1870s, with no permanent settlement or town infrastructure. The actual town of Tucumcari was established in 1901 as a railroad town, and it didn't officially receive its current name until 1908, making its appearance in an 1872 story completely impossible. The filmmakers likely chose Tucumcari simply because it sounded appropriately southwestern and exotic for their fictional Western setting, without researching the actual historical timeline of the town's establishment. This type of geographical liberty was common in spaghetti westerns, where Italian filmmakers often used American place names without deep knowledge of their historical contexts. The error becomes particularly noticeable when characters discuss train travel to and from Tucumcari, as the railroad infrastructure that would have made such travel possible didn't reach that area until decades after the film's supposed time period. This creates a situation where the movie's fictional timeline diverges significantly from actual American frontier history, placing characters in a town that existed only in the imagination of the screenwriters. Fact 13. The modern car desert drive. by a high-speed automobile is clearly visible driving across the desert landscape during a train conversation scene in For a Few Dollars More, creating another unintentional time-travel moment where 20th-century technology intrudes into the 1870s setting. The car appears in the distant background, moving from the lower right to the upper left of the frame at considerable speed, making it obvious that this is a modern vehicle rather than any form of period-appropriate transportation. This anachronistic mistake occurs during the sequence where Colonel Mortimer is traveling by train and engaging in conversation with other passengers, including a traveling salesman who mentions that the train does not stop in Tucumcari. The car becomes visible in the background during this dialogue, appearing in the desert landscape that stretches beyond the train window as the characters discuss their journey. The vehicle's high speed and distant position in the frame suggest that it was probably a crew member or local resident driving across the Spanish filming location without realizing they were passing through the camera's field of view. The car moves quickly enough that it might have been easy to miss during filming, especially if the director and cinematographer were focused on the foreground action and dialogue rather than carefully monitoring the distant background. This type of continuity error was particularly common during the era when For a Few Dollars More was produced, as film crews working in remote locations often had to contend with unexpected intrusions from the modern world. The Spanish desert locations that Sergio Leone used for his westerns were not completely isolated from contemporary life, making it possible for cars, airplanes, and other modern elements to accidentally wander into shots. The car's appearance joins the airplane lights as evidence that even the most carefully planned period films can be invaded by anachronistic elements, creating moments where the illusion of historical authenticity is broken by reminders of the contemporary world that existed just outside the camera frame. Fact 14. The identical musical pocket watch phenomenon. The film's central plot device revolves around two identical pocket watches that play the same haunting melody, but this seemingly simple story element was actually inspired by Ennio Morricone's groundbreaking technique of creating music that functions both as part of the actual story and as the film's background soundtrack at the same time. This innovative approach allowed Leone and Morricone to blur the line between what the characters hear and what the audience experiences, creating a unique cinematic effect. The pocket watches serve multiple narrative purposes throughout the film, as El Indio uses his watch to time gun duels, while Colonel Mortimer carries an identical watch that connects him to the villain through a tragic shared history. The melody that plays from both watches becomes a recurring musical theme that Morricone weaves throughout the entire score, sometimes as music that exists within the story world, and other times as traditional background music that only the audience can hear. Morricone explained that this technique allowed him to transfer the audience's thoughts to different emotional places, depending on how the watch music was used in each scene. When the characters wind up the watches and listen to the melody, the music becomes part of their reality, but when the same tune appears in the orchestral score during other moments, it creates psychological connections and memories for viewers. This dual-purpose musical approach was virtually unprecedented in Western films of the 1960s, where music typically served only as atmospheric background rather than as an active story element. The identical watches create a musical link between the protagonist and antagonist that drives the plot forward, while simultaneously providing Morricone with a foundation for building the film's entire musical structure. The success of this technique influenced Leone's future collaborations with Morricone, including the use of a harmonica in Once Upon a Time in the West, and other musical story devices that would become signatures of their creative partnership. Fact 15. Leone's unintentional Hollywood rule breaking. Sergio Leone unknowingly violated numerous unwritten 1960s Hollywood filmmaking rules while making For a Few Dollars More, creating a revolutionary Western that broke taboos and conventions he didn't even know existed, including showing the shooter and victim in the same frame during gunfights, depicting marijuana use on screen, and showing a horse being shot and killed during action sequences. These rule violations occurred because Leone was working outside the traditional Hollywood studio system and had little knowledge of the informal guidelines that American filmmakers followed to avoid controversy or censorship problems. Traditional Hollywood westerns of the era typically used editing techniques that avoided showing violence directly, cutting away from the moment of impact, or showing the shooter and victim in separate shots to minimize the graphic nature of gunfights. Leone's decision to keep both the gunman and his target visible in the same frame created a more immediate and visceral impact that shocked audiences accustomed to more sanitized Western violence. The inclusion of drug use, particularly El Indio's marijuana smoking, represented another significant departure from Hollywood standards, as major studio productions generally avoided depicting illegal drug consumption to prevent conflicts with censorship boards and moral watchdog groups. Leone included these elements simply because they served his story and character development, without considering the potential controversy they might create in different markets. The scene showing a horse being shot during a chase sequence violated another unspoken Hollywood rule about animal welfare in films, as American productions typically avoided depicting violence against animals, even when using special effects or careful staging to ensure no actual harm occurred. Leone's outsider status as an Italian filmmaker working with European financing allowed him to explore these previously forbidden territories, inadvertently creating a more adult-oriented Western that influenced how future filmmakers would approach violence, mature themes, and controversial subject matter in the genre. His rule-breaking approach helped establish the grittier, more realistic tone that would become characteristic of spaghetti westerns.